Welcome back to Easily Entertained. My name is Bryson Olson, and here we talk about all the good things of entertainment. Today we are talking about The Evil Dead, the first movie in the Evil Dead franchise, directed and written by Sam Raimi, a horror icon. It's kind of become a little bit of a cult classic, and seeing as we are in October, the peak time for watching scary movies, I thought we would take a look at this horror icon. I think it's a great time. So let's get started.
This kind of looks like your old girlfriend.
So, comedy and horror. Two genres that seem to kind of be in complete opposites of each other. One with the goal of making you essentially as happy as possible through laughter, and the other making you as unnerved as possible through fear. Kind of completely different tones they're going for right there. Yet, both are used together really often. It's not uncommon that you have a comedic horror film or a dark comedy. And while certainly not the first of its kind, I think The Evil Dead is a shining example of how it's done really well. First, though, I gotta kind of explain why these two genres combine so well, which I think primarily is through the concept of tension and release. It is used in both of these genres, and in the version of horror, it's, you're ramping up the tension through suspense. You're building things up. Maybe you're adding some music in, something is heard running around in like some abandoned location or something of that nature, and then it finally builds up and you have the release of the final scare, or you don't have the release, making the scare that much more unnerving. Or with comedy, you have the tension through build up, kind of figuring out some plot points within a joke. Maybe you're recurring some themes, and then eventually you get to the punchline, and that is your release. Both of these concepts follow that similar tension and release pattern. This allows both to coexist in a movie, I think, pretty harmoniously, as the release doesn't necessarily always have to be one or the other. It can be both as well. It kind of gives a perfect blend, which I think is really good. Now, in Evil Dead, the way it is used kind of goes all over. It kind of hits that both quite a lot. Taking turns or being used in conjunction with each other, I think, is the overall aspect that it tries to take. So for like the horror element, Cheryl is a pretty good example of that, especially at the beginning. She starts getting tormented by the spirits, with the recording as that goes on. It kind of freaks her out a little bit, but it's not crazy. It's more just making her uneasy, and like they have a slight release when like the tree goes through the window, but overall it's still mainly amping up the tension. Strange things are happening around the cabin, making the suspense go up, and then she runs off into the forest, but then the forest becomes sentient and grabs her, making her scared, and that's kind of where a bit of a release comes in. So this is the horror aspect of The Evil Dead. Scotty is more an example of the comedy element, albeit kind of a corny one, but that's kind of Sam Raimi's style, so it kind of fits within this. So the scene where they go in the basement is like a pretty good example, I would say. Suspense is ramping up as it kind of feels weird, things feel a little bit creepy, but Scotty is using that suspense to give punchlines rather than scares, saying that the knife they find looks like Ash's old girlfriend, or he's holding a shotgun right at him, making him jump and laugh. So he's obviously like the comedic aspect. And kind of with comedy, you can use the suspense as well, like that horror is providing, and end it with a joke rather than a scare, which is kind of why these two coalesce so well, is because you can use aspects from each. So like if you were building up a joke in a comedy movie, you could, instead of ending it with a punchline, you end it with a scare, because they kind of interlock in that way. I feel like the dead in this movie are really good at representing both, having them both at the exact same time, because they can be scary when they actually have power, like when you have such visceral attacks, or they are able to break out of things just because they're going crazy. That I feel like is really good for the scary aspect, but also they're kind of goofy, like they're hella dumb essentially. Like, not entirely, like they're still pretty conscious, but at the same time it's like they're a little bit ridiculous because their power is just very easily taken away just as much as it can be given, because they can just be simply locked up, or one of them, they have a bad ankle and so they're just dragged outside, boom, crisis averted. That's pretty easy. But this kind of allows Evil Dead to establish a pretty good blend of both comedy and horror, while not really discrediting either side. And I really like that. I think it's what leads later franchises to follow similar tactics, as it's so effective. But we'll talk about other franchises a bit later in this episode. Horror is a very unique genre within the movie industry, particularly when it comes to visual effects, as horror allows for a lot of experimenting with very low risk in doing so. A horror movie can get away with being a little bit experimental, as it can kind of just be chalked up to trying to add to the horror. Even if it's goofy, people like comedy and horrors, like we just talked about, so they can kind of get away with it even if it's bad. And The Evil Dead, I think, is one movie that tries to take this experimental aspect and really runs with it to either amp up the horror or the comedy bits, like we just talked about. One aspect that I think very effectively impacts both parts of the movie, the comedy and the horror, as well as like kind of through the rest of the Evil Dead franchise, is the use of the over-the-top gore. I think especially for that time, it was not as common to have as much gore as this one did. In some areas, it even had like an X rating. So they have like some moments, like the pencil getting jabbed into Linda's ankle, is something that works so well as gore, because it just makes you wince, and you know exactly how it would feel, because it's like the razor scooter hitting your shin type feeling, just way worse. Other moments kind of make you laugh because they're just super absurd with like how gory they are or how bloody it gets, like blood or any kind of liquid spurting from the dead as they writhe around. Because like, while typically used in traditional horror, it's meant to really make you feel the impact of the killer or whatever is going on, and in some moments in this it does. In this movie, it's used a lot more in conjunction with the latter to make you jump back and forth from witnessing something grotesque and horrifying to something comedic and corny. And I think being able to use this specific kind of visual effects and apply it to different tones throughout the movie is something that Evil Dead just does incredibly well. And probably the best aspect of special effects used in this movie that I love pretty much anytime it's used is the use of stop motion. The Book of the Dead, when it's burning, when the bodies are dissolving, that like at the same time, I just think it's a very effective way at conveying something that is very otherworldly. Stop motion just has that feeling that almost kind of feels beyond our understanding. Like, we know how stop motion works, but at the same time, it's just very, like, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. Like, it just doesn't feel right sometimes, which I think is great. Like, especially in like an animation context, I just think it's great. But I feel like in a horror movie context, that is very effective. Plus, it was very innovative for the time as to when this movie was released, because it was in 1981. CGI wasn't really even remotely going to be useful around here, so you got to find some other way to achieve these similar effects, and stop motion is probably going to be the way to do that. Bringing an inanimate object like the Necronomicon to life, essentially it's embodied by a demon. How do you show that it's embodied by a demon? The book is made essentially to look like a face, but how do you fully grasp its power? Use stop motion. You need to portray it in a way that you can actually see on screen, and in a way that is eerie enough, which I think stop motion is perfect for. Plus, like I've said in many episodes prior to this, wherever you can find a good way to incorporate some kind of animation techniques into a movie that isn't animated on its own, I think that's great. I am a fan of whenever they can do that. But overall, the special effects in Evil Dead, I think, just do a really great job at elevating the tone that the movie is going for, both the comedy and the horror, and just does a really good job, especially because those two, the combination of them, is a genre that just takes a little bit of fine-tuning to get right. And I think Sam Raimi, who was the director and did a fantastic job, getting the special effects in it to help, that was definitely the way to go. So already, Evil Dead had some inspirations it took for its premise, like the dead effects, like the kind of like gnarly skin or like rotting skin type look. It is very similar to that of like The Exorcist. That is usually what I think of whenever I see it. And I feel it's not even just this movie. I feel like a lot of movies that, if you're dealing with possessions or some kind of zombie or paranormal type looking thing, The Exorcist is like a really good blueprint for how you're going to do those special effects. And I think they do a great job. You have the very clear influence of Lovecraft for the Book of the Dead. Like, that's just straight up H.P. Lovecraft. That's the Necronomicon. And in a lot of depictions, it's very much similar to the one that is used in The Evil Dead. And obviously, it's just a very general zombie-esque type vibe, similar to just many zombie movies before. I could name a bunch. The Night of the Living Dead, obviously, that's probably like the biggest one. But what about the impact that Evil Dead provided? Well, Sam Raimi has always kind of had his specific style with high dynamic visuals and kind of corny characters, which is a good thing. I don't think it's bad. And he does follow that in his later movies. Like, it is something that is just him. But for movies not encompassed by him, but following similar genres, we tend to get pretty similar aspects. I feel like a lot of them take inspiration from Evil Dead. For example, verite style filmmaking, or essentially filming something kind of handheld, like a fly on the wall, a documentary type style where you're kind of following things. It's very present within the Evil Dead franchise and goes on further in other movies. I think probably the biggest example that takes it a bigger step forward and kind of makes that the whole premise of the movie is the Blair Witch Project. It's a found footage film, and like, that's verite style filmmaking, but brought to an extreme. It's so handheld that it is, the whole point of the movie is that it is something that the people were actively recording, and then it's like, you found it. Great. So it kind of pushed that a little bit forward. You also have Cabin in the Woods. Need I really explain how the connection happens with the Evil Dead? Because the whole premise of Evil Dead is a group of friends goes to a cabin in the woods and gets possessed. Premise kind of goes pretty hand in hand. I feel like it makes sense. So clearly the inspiration is there. But you also have the comedic horror aspects of the genre and some slightly aware characters, like Cheryl. She was pretty aware that something crazy was going on, and Ash sort of was too. He was like, oh, something's going down, but like, they're ignoring it. And I feel like that is brought to extreme in Scream. Like, that one is the self-aware comedy horror movie. Like, everyone knows that it is it is fully aware and actively calls out the tropes within horror movies and still manages to make a fun story. So, like, these all kind of take inspiration from Evil Dead because they can all take the little aspects they want from it and, you know, kind of expand upon them. And what I kind of like is none of these properties, other than the actual franchise itself, outright copies Evil Dead. Like, they will take aspects from it, and you can kind of see the influence of this cult classic across all these different kinds of movies, but it's not usually attempted to be just a straight copy of it. People usually change it in their own ways, and I think that's great. And I think what truly sets it apart within Raimi's work, like, other than the Spider-Man movie, which was very influential to the superhero genre, I think this is just super influential to the horror genre. I think it's that fly on the wall type feeling, that something evil is lurking, and sometimes switching to the perspective of that evil, I think is just very, very much Sam Raimi. And then it gets used in other things, and I like that it can leak into other areas, and I think that's wonderful. Evil Dead is just a great example of experimental filmmaking, especially because they only made it for a little over $300,000, and he was only like 20, I think, when he was making it, which is crazy. I want to be able to do something like that. That'd be crazy. That's awesome. They just did a great job and combined great aspects of other genres while also making it its own thing that can last, I think, for years, especially among horror fans. So now let's get into our rating for The Evil Dead. If you don't know, our easily entertained rating scale from least to best, it is garbage, once is fine, right mood, quotable, go to, and all day, every day. And I'm going to put The Evil Dead at right mood. Not because it's not a great movie, because I do think it's fantastic. And for some people, it may be an all day, every day. But as far as horror movies go, I do not think that this is the horror movie that I would watch on repeat all the time. Like, I watch it maybe once, maybe twice a year, and it's going to be more often during October, but other horror movies I feel like I can watch at other times. So that is kind of why I feel like this one goes more in right mood for me. If you have a different opinion, let us know in the comments. But speaking of comments, we have our question of the week, designed to just get you invested in the conversation a little bit, you know, give your own thoughts. It is, what is your favorite horror movie? And for me, I was really having to think about this, and I feel like I've probably answered this question before, and I've probably given different answers every time. But I feel like it kind of depends on the kind of horror. Comedy horror, I feel like Scream, that franchise I think is pretty good for me for comedy horror. I love it. I think it's a great time. For like more true horror, that's just, it's like there are some comedic elements, but it's mainly focusing on the horror. Probably the Conjuring movies. I feel like those ones are just so effective at being creepy, and you know, they add the little, this was based on a real story, and I don't know how accurate that actually is, but at least a little bit is a little bit freaky. So I feel like The Conjuring is pretty good, but there are just, there's so many good horror properties. You have It, you have The Shining, you have The Thing, you have Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm. There's so many. So, you know, any of them are justifiably your favorite. So comment down below, you know, I want to hear what your favorite is. And that's it for this episode of Easily Entertained. I hope you enjoyed. Please leave a like and a subscribe so that you can be notified of all the latest episodes when they come out every Tuesday. And then sometimes we have a little bonus episode. Like last week, we had Harry Potter, and we were covering all the movies, so we had 2 big episodes. It was a great time. So, you know, if you want to see all the episodes when they come out, whether they're on Tuesday or a different day, just saying, you should subscribe. It's a good time. If you have any suggestions on movies or TV shows or whatever, any entertainment properties that you would like to see us review in the future, let us know in the comments down below. And until next time, bye.